You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku, and today we're going to actually read a paper. Tonight, I haven't read a paper in a little bit. I hope you guys checked out the last episode where I read more of those African myths and stories and folktales. There's really a lot even adults can get from those stories, and when you read the stories and the plans that I have behind the scenes with those stories is phenomenal as well. Well, when you read the stories and you start to expand out and study parts of the story, study the animals, study the cultures and the languages, we really have something good to work with. Our ancestors left us something that we can now turn it into something and work with it and build something for our future, our children, this nation that we want to create. Before I go any further, I want to remind you, I do have a Discord server, which you can feel free to hop in if you're on Discord already. And even if you're not, it's nothing. It's a free app for desktop and for mobile. Hop on, right, and join us. You can join us. You could, if you're just interested in being there for the podcast and seeing what the podcast has to offer, you can join us for that. If you believe in what we're talking about every week when we talk about this African-centered curriculum, you want to be a part of that. You want to put in some work because you want to be the best African you can possibly be, an African to be remembered, right? You want to jump in on that, you could join as a curriculum writing team, right? And we could just have general fun going forward in the Discord as well. The more the merrier. Some of you know I've been playing, usually on Saturday nights for the last couple of weeks, I've been playing a movie. Attendance was pretty low, so I decided, well, I'll resume maybe next month, being as Black History Month as well. Maybe I'll resume next month, a night or two, but I really want the numbers to grow. By the way, if you were in our WhatsApp group, the Think Tank group, I announced today that I'm closing that group at midnight tonight. So everyone who's in there, please click the link that I put up in there, join the Discord, right? The Discord has more features, allows us to do a lot more. And there's already some work that's being done in there, for those who didn't know, from the WhatsApp group. Come on in, hop on, and check out what we're doing. Just today, I got a curriculum critique and a book consideration review. You guys should make sure to hop on there and give your critiques, right? When you get on the Discord, just add everyone or at me or whatever and ask, how can you get involved with the curriculum? We definitely want to make some strides with that curriculum. I think, to be quite frank, I think we've had that curriculum up for too long for the members not to have jumped on, and for more members not to have jumped on and done the critique. For those of you who did, I appreciate you. For those who are still working on it, I appreciate you still. And even those who didn't do anything, I still appreciate you, but I'd appreciate it if you jump on and start doing this work. Before we get into tonight's reading, I want to remind you guys as I usually do. If you're on YouTube watching this, you'll look in the lower right-hand corner and you'll see the banner for KWAZ Radio. This show is a part of the shows on KWAZ Radio. It's a part of the podcast network. You guys should be checking out other shows on the network as well. And there's some new episodes recently from two of the shows, and I know that the Pro Black Perspective will probably be doing his worship tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Right? The Queen's Council has a new show, and the Harsh Reality podcast has a new show, has a new episode, sorry. As a matter of fact, take a listen here.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
So we're reading this paper called African Identity and Slavery in the Americas by Michael A. Gomez. It starts off like this. We will never know what we want to know about African enslavement in the Americas until we understand who the Africans were. New World slavery certainly qualifies as one of the most important chapters in the history of labor, and in truth informs, if not transforms, the meaning of labor in the Western Hemisphere in a fundamental way. Slavery has served, just the most inappropriate time, right? Slavery has served and continues, let me just mute this before I get another call. As I was saying, slavery has served and continues to serve as a measure by which workers assess the equity of wages, working conditions, benefits, and relations with management, so that slavery has been and continues to be the touchstone of American labor movements. Those movements began with Africans forcibly removed to myriad circumstances in the West, where they were called upon to provide every conceivable service in support of economies both within and beyond colonial eras. The full response of Africans to their enslavement, however, will never be appreciated if only interpreted through the lone prism of labor. Africans were workers, but they were far more than that. They had lived as members of specific societies in Africa, so that although their lives were altered by enslavement, they continued to be informed by both the African antecedent and by the unique combinations of their distinctive backgrounds in the various locales of the Americas. Their cultural and social provenances therefore became critical to grasping the totality of their sojourn and its relation to corresponding experiences elsewhere. It may be that scholars of North American history are uncomfortable with the idea of the enslaved as Africans. Based upon the voluminous literature on slavery concerning the nascent United States, there seems to be a consensus and a decided preference for writing about Africans as slaves. Leading authorities on slavery in North America produce with impunity tome after tome with little regard for the fact that their subjects came out of special social and political contexts, that they had collective identities, and they participated in recognizable cultures. In fact, it is perfectly acceptable for scholars of North American slavery to have absolutely no background or training in African history and political economy. It is not that the African background is beyond reach or unattainable. It is not that the scholarship on Africa has not made substantial progress over the last 30 years. Rather, this lamentable state of affairs is the confluential consequence of at least two factors: an abysmal low level of dialogue between Africanists and Americanists, and a lingering, arrogant assumption in the academy that an appreciation of the African background is at best tangential to North American slavery. A view in part sustained by the mistaken argument that a relatively smaller importation of Africans into North America vis-a-vis the Caribbean and South America renders their origins unimportant. The objectification of the African, therefore, necessarily continues, notwithstanding protestations to the contrary. Clearly, the status quo is egregious, intolerable, and no longer justifiable. The day of the learned scholar of North American slavery, unlearned in the histories and cultures of Africa, is mercifully coming to an end. Recent work on the history of North American slavery demonstrates both the necessity and the viability of envisioning the enslaved as Africans in North America. A number of books and articles can be mentioned, but there are three which are particularly noteworthy. Gwendolyn Midlow Hall's study of Africans in colonial Louisiana demonstrates the potential of applying a class analysis to workers who were simultaneously cultural and socio-political agents. Margaret Washington's discussion of the Gullah explores very specific linkages between the Georgia, South Carolina coast and West Africa, and provides an example of effective scholarly method. Sterling Stuckey's examination extends beyond slavery, but his point is that the enslavement experience is crucial to understanding what follows. His elaboration of ring ceremonies and the shout in particular is important, but more pertinent for the purposes of this essay is his success in identifying these rites with certain groups and territories within Africa. In all three studies, there is clearly established pattern of moving the discourse from generalization to specification. We are no longer talking about Africans in abstraction. Rather, the faces and perspectives of more precisely and carefully defined groups of Africans are materializing. In my own work, I have tried to extend the logical implications of these seminal studies. Just give me a second here. Shout out to Pro-Black Perspective that's in the room, in the chat room. Appreciate you. All right. While such efforts as the aforementioned are a beginning, they are only a beginning. There is so much more to be learned from approaching the enslaved as Africans with distinct heritages. Fortunately, the growth and expansion of the African diaspora as a field of organized academic inquiry is providing a much-needed analytical context and stimulus for the study of Africans throughout the Americas, including North America. The concept of the African diaspora allows scholars to have conventionally worked within territorially defined boundaries to begin, why is this paper all over the place? To begin transcending those circumscriptions and to initiate the process of reconfiguring the paradigms, working across disciplines and incorporating multiple methodologies. A knowledge of Africa becomes central to the enterprise, transforming it from mere variant on a theme of comparative inquiry to one in which a series of exchanges along cultural, political, and social lines are simultaneously negotiated between Africa and multiple sites within the diaspora. In fact, the surge of intellectual activity in the African diaspora is increasingly revealing just how retarded the scholarship on North American slavery really is. For example, it is practically a matter of course that the discussion of enslaved Africans in Latin America and the Caribbean is placed within the framework of specific provenance, and this has characterized the secondary literature for decades. While the background and accomplishments of Africans are not always highly esteemed, the fact that Africans are cultural agents is at least acknowledged. Read that again. While the background and accomplishments of Africans are not always highly esteemed, the fact that Africans are cultural agents is at least acknowledged. Insofar as the African presence is concerned, then, North Americanists have much to learn from their Latin Americanist and West Indianist colleagues. I already know a couple of groups that ain't gonna like this too much. A brief consideration of only a few examples of a vast literature will make the point. Perhaps the most obvious place to begin is with Brazil, where the discourse concerning the African presence during enslavement has seen its share of controversy. From the benign school, best represented by Gilberto Freire, and in particular his 1933 publication Casa Grande e Senzala, to the Sao Paulo school led by Emilia Viotti da Costa, Florestan Fernandez, and Fernando Henrique Cardoza, the debate centered on the severity of the institution and vacillated between placing an emphasis on the overall impact of slavery and the inner lives of the enslaved. Polar positions successfully merged by Katia M. de Quiros Matoso in 1979. For whatever the position taken, few such scholars have argued against seeing Africans as members of specific sociocultural groups, or what could be called in some cases ethnicities, and what in point of fact were called KWAZ in Brazil. I could have butchered that word. Let's see if there's a Brazilian in the chat room who's gonna tell me the real pronunciation, right? Africans were seen as members of varying nações or KWAZ, and whether the collective identity was imported from Africa or was assembled in Brazil is really a minor point. Africans responded to enslavement as members of nações, often rebelling on the basis of ethnicity, forming cooperative ventures such as the Irmandades, or brotherhoods, on that same premise. Indeed, it is customary to see in the literature whole chapters devoted to an examination of the procendius Africanus, or African origins of Black Brazilians, and the distinctions are often carried and made applicable throughout the body of the work. Negros, or Yoruba Minas, Hausas, Tapas or Noops, Bornas, Fulas, Jejes, Mandingas, or Mandingueros, Congos, and Angolas, some of whom were Muslim while others remained faithful to uniquely African religions, very much informed the analysis. The fact that these terms at times refer to sociocultural groups and at other times to geographic locations does not obscure the fact that Africans in Brazil recognize their lives around identities initially formed on African soil. It is not possible to discuss Africans in Brazil as constituting a single community without referring to their procedencias. So, that leads me to a question. Because they're talking about Brazil, but you'll see this across the Caribbean too, where folks might not call themselves houses or what have you for the Caribbean, but they carried on names of places in the continent in their communities. Congo Town, right? You can go to Congo Town, etc. In Haiti has, I can't remember the names now, but they have several places named after either places or peoples from the continent. As I read a paper some months back, during the time of the Haitian Revolution, a lot of those Africans had, in Haiti, grouped themselves by what was referred to here as their ethnicity or their brotherhood, right? So you had Congo people together. What's the other group? I'm drawing a blank now, but there's different groups that were in Haiti, and they banded together, right? They identified themselves, as their group, and they stuck together. They were all Africans, right? But they tended to stick to themselves based on their ethnicities. The question I have is for you guys, is that did the Africans in America, the enslaved Africans in America, did they have something similar? Like, did the people who came to the America, and I know the system was rough, but some will argue that the system was so rough in the Caribbean, for example, and South America, that the Africans there really held on to their ethnicities, their identities, even through slavery, right? And my question is there evidence that Americans, for you guys who are listening, is there evidence that the Africans in America, North America, did they continue to identify with their ethnicities? Did they name, areas that, where they lived after where they came from? I know that it was practiced in North America to separate people who, to mix up a bunch of people who spoke different tongues. But at the same time, you still will find someone who spoke your tongue, right? Eventually. My question is, did people reorganize themselves in the Americas? Did the enslaved Africans in the Americas ever reorganize themselves and identified with their group on the continent? You guys can post that in the comment section in the chat, or if you're listening to playback, post a comment from your study. All right, post your answer in the comment section. The case of Brazil presents few surprises, as the expectation of African continuities runs high. In fact, Brazil is often used to demonstrate how un-African North America was, or is. This contention will be addressed later. At this point, it is sufficient to see that to be African in Brazil during and often after slavery was to live in close identification with and proximity to a proscribed community, at times in sympathy with others from Africa, but with the understanding that ethnic or cultural heterogeneity was to be maintained. These were choices made by Africans, right? I like that whole paragraph, and that's an interesting concept. The non-Spanish speaking Caribbean provides interesting examples of ethnically articulated African identities and patterns reminiscent of the Brazilian experience. Concerning Saint Dominique, Gabriel Debian relates that of 14,167 named persons enslaved in 1796 and 1797, there was 6,188 of African origin. Some of whom, okay, so these are the names I was trying to remember. Some of whom could be divided into the following categories: Congo, like I said, Nago, Arada, Igbo, Bambara, Hausa, Senegals, Susu, Pulads, Mandika, and Malis. And as I read down those names, they gave the numbers, and the numbers were decreasing. So most of the Africans in Saint Dominique, which is Haiti, most of those Africans were Congo, right? Second most was Nego. Third was Arada. Fourth was Igbo, and so forth, right? If you remember a couple months back, I read a paper that broke this down as well, right? The people still identified with their folks. So this is, and just to be clear, like, this is from a census where these slavers, Africans, who are you? Where are you from? And this is their response, right? Of these 6,000, of these 6,200, enslaved Africans, right? Almost 1,700 of them were able to say, look, I'm from the Congo. Almost 800 were able to say, look, I'm from, I'm Nago. Or I'm Arada, or I'm Igbo, right? And I believe that this right here is an example of why we have the problem we have today with the ADOS and the FBA groups, which is why I asked the question I asked earlier. Because there wasn't a continuance, or a strong continuance, perhaps, I'm not sure of the answer, right? Maybe that's why it's so easy for our folks to get sidetracked with this ADOS and FBA stuff. Similar distinctions were made in Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Guyana by observers in the 17th and 18th centuries. David Barry Gaspar and Mavis Campbell have determined that Akan affiliation was crucial to certain developments in Antigua and Jamaica, respectively, while Michael Mullen has likewise emphasized the Akan element in revolts throughout the English colonies, particularly Jamaica. Some of the more fascinating work on ethnicity in the West Indies, in fact, postdates slavery proper and concerns the importation of indentured laborers in 19th century Trinidad. Maureen Warner Lewis has compiled studies which take as their premise the perpetuation of African identity in Trinidad as a function of ethnicity, having interviewed informants from 1966 to 1972, who even then claimed precise descent from Igbo, Kizi, Wolof, Popo from Dahomey, and Akan forebearers. The memory of the Hausa, the Mandinka, the Gurunzi of Ghana, and even the Fulbe was yet alive among these descendants. But in particular, the Yoruba and Yoruba culture were recalled. As is the case with Brazil, there is a substantial secondary literature on the Caribbean for which the notion of African ethnicity is certainly familiar. Spanish-speaking America conforms to the general pattern. This is expected in the instance of Cuba, where importation of Africans was substantial and protracted. To take only two examples of the literature, Fernando Ortiz's 1906 study of African culture in Cuba, as problematic as it is, pays particular attention to the Lucimi, Yoruba, contribution to brujeria, or witchcraft, while also making references to a Muslim presence on the island. Esteban Montejo, famous autobiography, reveals a wide range of cultural continuities with Africa. Is Esteban Montejo that the fellow from Fantasy Island, or am I getting mixed up? Right? Cultural continuities with Africa. I makes the following observation, quote, on the sugar mills, plantations, there were blacks of distinct nations. Each one had its characteristics. Habos, I guess it said, of mixed white and black ancestry. They were usually small boys. The Mandingas were of medium complexion. They were tall and very strong. As far as my mother was concerned, they were bad influences and criminals. That's your black and brown coalition right there, right? They always kept to themselves. The Gangas from Congo were good people. They were short with freckled faces. Many were living as runaways. The Carabalas were fierce like the Congos. The skeptic would surmise that such categorizations based upon perceived ethnicity were largely derived. Can you guys hear me? I saw something just now that OBS disconnected. If you can hear me, press 1 in the chat. Right? If I was Tariq and shit, I'd say, yo, they're messing with my streams. Make sure to donate, hit the cash app. They're messing with my streams, but that's not, I don't do whole shit like that. Right? Right. There is no doubt that some Africans were given putative group names by slaveholders, but there's no question, but that some were misidentified. But it must be remembered that fictive identity was a universal phenomenon formulated all over the world and during much of human history. Persons taken as prisoners of war or by way of kidnapping may have eventually wound up in the Americas or in the Islamic world, but as many never left African soil, they entered into a continuum of relation with the host society whereby the stranger gradually, often over generations, overcame her or his alien status and moved closer to the ideal of socially sanctioned familial ties. In time, legal fiction hold on, just lost where I was. In time, legal fiction invariably became still a cultural reality. Such historical verities should give pause, but should not deter us from recognizing group identity in Africa or Asia or Europe, and should not hinder the process in the Americas. Even so, there are even more compelling reasons to conclude that African ethnicity played a powerful role in the Americas. Yeah, just remember that guy from Finding Sea Island who was something Montalban or whatever, so it's not him. But this reminds me, like, and this is why, and if you've heard me talk about this before, this is all of these things are my issues with the ADOS and FBA stuff, right? All of this is my issue, because, like, for example, I saw Onita say post recently that I think it was a grandfather or great grandfather of his, he just learned, came from the continent with about 300 people to Jamaica, right? And we're not talking about enslaved people, right? I think the gentleman was like a businessman. If Onita is still here, he could type it in the chat room what the situation really was, right? This is why when I listen to the ADOS FBA stuff, if the folks who claim that ADOS FBA stuff would get serious and look at their histories, all these folks who are claiming to be ADOS from the plantation or whatever, which is just silly, would recognize that, dude, you guys have been mixed in with Caribbeans for the longest time, you know, mixed in with Africans. So, you know, this nonsense that, you know, you were here already, right? And that you were mixed in with the Native Americans who were here, and by the way, they were black too. I mean, come on, guys. Really look up your stories. I can tell you for a fact that my great-grandfather, right, father to my grandmother, left his country in the Caribbean and came to the States on something they called the Project, which was a part of that Reconstruction era. And my grandmother, if memory serves me right, and I'm pretty sure it's right, she never met the man. And after a certain amount of time of him sending letters and money back home, they stopped hearing from him. You know what happened? He took up his own life out here, his own identity. So when you hear about people who are majors, right? That's not my surname, but that was my grandmom's name. You hear people who are named majors out here in the Carolinas and stuff like that. Y'all check what y'all talking about. And that's one man. There were many men who came from the top of the Caribbean down to the bottom, who came here and set up lives and ended up having families and generations of people. This idea that you some special people, more special than the rest of us, is just nonsense. You're mixed in with us, and we're mixed in with you. I talked about this on the show before. There's an area in Trinidad called Fifth Company. I learned it a little while ago that Fifth Company was populated by slaves who got away from America. If you could get away from America, Fifth Company was open for you to come down there and live. And after emancipation in America, a lot of slaves from the States here went down there and set up shop. So this idea that it's different people and all this old shit, y'all gotta stop that now. And I think a part of the problem, and it's something that when you do your DNA test and stuff, it's something that you should really look into and look at. But and by the way, I've heard this is no ad for them, but I've heard that the AfricanAncestry.com is the best one for us, you know, to partake in. I think if we start to live a life where we identify with the group, right? We'll always remember, never forget that we are, in fact, Africans, right? To continue, Esteban Montejo recorded his Cuban memoirs in the late 19th century, so definitely not the Fantasy Island guy. However, some 400 years earlier, in the 15th century, similar distinctions among Africans were already being made. To be sure, the Portuguese and Spanish had become acquainted with sub-Saharan Africans via the Muslim occupation of Iberia, beginning in the 8th century. You're talking about the Moors here. By 1462, the Portuguese had come to know inhabitants of Senegambia better than others. Interestingly, the Portuguese did not call them Senegambians or Senegals, but Negros de Jaloj or Haloj, a reference to the state of Jolof. Isn't that something? Isn't that something? By 1522, the Wolof of Senegambia were known as the Gelofs by the Spanish and were fingered in Hispaniola as troublemakers, along with Jews, Moors, Moriscos, and Ladinos, or acculturated blacks, such that a series of royal decrees were repeatedly issued to ban their importation into Hispaniola. The troublemakers. In their place, the Spanish developed a preference for Negros Bozales, or non-Spanish speaking, recently arrived Africans, as they were thought to be easier to control. By the middle of the 16th century, however, the Spanish had become much more familiar with Africans and took some care in distinguishing enslaved Jolofes from the Mandingos in Mexico. You see how these folks study us, man? By 1570, we have documents referring to the Castas de Rios de Guinea, or the nations of the rivers of Guinea, as the land of the Jolofes, Biafras, and Mandingos. By 1600, the Castas de Angola were added and further divided into the Luandas, Benguelas, Congos, and Manicongos. For that same century, Gonzalo Aguero Beltran has produced documentation for some 501 enslaved persons in Mexico, out of the total of more than 20,569 Africans, who were placed into some 29 categories. The latter, a mixture of place names, for example, Guinea, Mozambique, and ethnic or group affiliations like the Zap, the Mina, the Arara. Clearly, the Spanish and Portuguese were learning rapidly. These people know how to designate you, and you are going against your designation. As Colin Palmer points out, Mexico and Peru were the two largest slave importers in the 16th and 17th centuries. By the second half of the 17th century, these importations were in sharp decline. But even so, some Africans had labored in Mexico by 1827, the year of formal emancipation. Long before then, the view of Africans as members of particular naciones, like the Brazilian Nações, was fully elaborated. The Saracole, Mandinka, Susa, Maasai, Bambara, Fulbi, divided into the Fula and the Tucolor, and the Hausa are delineated as such in the primary documentation and the secondary literature on Mexican slavery. Customarily includes a discussion of the procedencia, the origin of the Africans. As for Peru, Africans began trickling into the colony as early as 1529, initially to work the silver mines. 256 enslaved persons identified as Africans in Peru prior to 1560. 45 were Wolof, 40 Biafras, 23 were Bran, 15 were Mandinga, and 1 was Fulbi. In fact, during the 16th and 17th centuries, the elaboration of African naciones included the following, again, a mix of state designations, ports, and ethnic languages: Bran, Biafra, Berbesi, Cholofo, Mandingo, Nalu, Banyol, Kasanga, Fula, Bayoho, Guinea, Tulupo, Soso, Balanta, Terra Nova, Zap, Kokoli, Bleblo, Arara, Caravali, Mina, Lusimi, Congo, Mozambique, Anchico, Benguela, Angola, Alonga, Malemba, Musanga. By 1640, there were perhaps 30,000 Africans in all of Peru, and Lima's population was at least 50% African until that year. Miscegenation between Spanish men and African and Native American women was extensive. See that here? Miscegenation between Spanish men and African and Native American women was extensive, such that a popular saying was thought to encapsulate 17th century Peruvian society. He who is not descended from an Inca is descended from a Mandinka. Think about that. Interestingly, Senegambians imported into Puerto Rico after 1680 would also be collectively referred to as Mandingas. So this is why, I'm beating that African drum again. This is why curriculum is so important. The public school system in North America will never tell you this, because it would encourage you to figure out who you are and where you came from, and it would tie you back to your country of origin, right? So right here, even I'm getting a schooling here that, hey, one of the things we need to look at in this curriculum, I've talked about it in a broader sense, based on these African stories and mythology that I've been reading. You take the story, you take the people that it comes from, and you talk about the region, the people, the customs, you break it down into the language, you learn some of the language from the people. But now this also, when we talk about history, you want to get it into the child's mind that, listen, certain amount of your people were from here, or were from there, and this was the cosmology of the area where you're from, be it the Caribbean, South America, North America, or wherever. These are the people, the types of people that made up, right, those people that you descended from. And it's clear that we are not, and this is a failing of any Pan-African or Black nationalists or African nationalists. This is our failing, right? We should have been teaching and pushing the idea of connecting to a group. I just read at least a dozen groups just now, right? Connect to a group. And now with the technology that we have out here, I just mentioned, AfricanAncestry.com, look up your ancestry. And never forget who you are. I hope I'm still coming through, and I've got to answer in the chat room. It's all good though. Looks like I'm still coming through, so I'll just continue. It is in Santo Domingo, however, that some of the most fascinating data has been recovered. As Carlos Larrazabal Blanco observes, quote, from the first years of the foundation of the city of Santo Domingo in 1496 there existed slaves. The very first slaves, whites, Berbers, or blacks, must have been imported illegally. Later, by way of Cape Verde, came the Jolofos, the Mandingas, the Branes, the Zapes, the Biafras. From Sao Tome arrived Minas, Popos, Barbas, Falas, Arares, Lukumis, Carabalis, and from Luanda, Congos, and Angolas. It was often the case in Santo Domingo, as was true elsewhere in the New World, that Africans either took or were given ethnic or place name designations as surnames. Thus we read of Pedro Angola, married to Victoriana Angola, Francisco Biafra, the husband of Luisa Manacongo, Lucia Arara, the wife of Pedro Congo, and so on. There are numerous examples of this naming pattern. So I know, like, I want to say it's in New Orleans, but somewhere in the south of North America, someone pointed this out one time that in Africa it was the occasion. It was traditional that you were named after a day of the week, especially in West Africa. Right? You were named after a day of the week. And there was a male counterpart name, there was a female counterpart name, right? And someone pointed out that if you look at the South in North America, down south, it wasn't uncommon for people to name their children after days of the week. Tuesday, and Friday, and Friday and such like that, right? That's an African thing, right? And we need to do more of that. We need to engage more, more so African than just some Scandinavian names, but or Roman names. But we need to engage in this African culture a little bit more. We need to name ourselves with African names. As was the case throughout the Americas, such groupings were stereotyped as possessing distinguishing characteristics. By the way, that's kind of like one of my pet peeves with the NOI. Those guys just say, well, we're X or something like that. And dude, you could just pick up the last name Congo, right? Pick up the last name Mani Congo, Biafra, Angola. These guys went with X, and I'm not, it is what it is, but to me there was a better alternative as to X, which supposedly means the unknown. And then again, if you think of yourself as Asiatic or whatever, as was the case throughout the Americas, such groupings were stereotyped as possessing distinguishing characteristics. Often the slaveholders rendered the assessment, but as was seen in the case of Esteban Montejo, Africans and their descendants also held certain views of other Africans. One 18th century depiction of the ethnic kaleidoscope in Santo Domingo seems to be a composite image incorporating both African and slaveholder perspectives, such that, quote, the Senegalese are seen as insolent and thieves, the Fante as extremely proud and ready to commit suicide, the Arda women as always arguing and gossiping, Igbo as difficult to manage and given to suicide when subjected to the least punishment or ridicule, the Congo as docile and happy. Equally true of the Angolas and other Bantu blacks, with the exception of the Mondongos, who were fared among the same Africans. Right. All this you should learn. You should be learning this in school. Reputations were not uniform throughout the diaspora. However, as the following statement on Africans in Paraguay reveals, quote, with respect to races or ethnic groups, of the many Africans who were taken into trade, the Senegalese were the easiest to discipline and the best suited for domestic work. The Bambara were famous for their love of thievery. The Arada were skillful in agriculture, but proud. The Congos were skillful fishermen, but of short stature and given to absconding. The Negos, the humane. The Mondongo, the cruelest. The Minas, the most determined, capricious, and given to desperation. Similar information exists for Uruguay, Venezuela, Chile, and Costa Rica. Now, when I say you need to learn this in your own schools, you need to learn this in your own schools that these other people saw you this way. And what we really want to do is to rewrite how we see each other based on how these people describe us. What we really want to do is to go now and to look at the Mondongo people in the continent today. How are they now? How have they been traditionally before you know the European encounter, right? But these are groups of people we need to be learning about. Why do they think the Senegalese are the easiest to discipline? What's that about? We need to understand this for ourselves, right? There are at least two lessons that can be extracted from the foregoing depictions. One, responses to enslavement were certainly informed by the cultural and social antecedent, but not to the extent that behavior was predictable, especially in light of divergent New World circumstances. And two, the veracity of these characterizations is not the real issue, but rather the likelihood that slaveholders made decisions regarding such matters as labor assignments and material treatment based upon such perceptions. Even social order within the enslaved community was probably affected by these appraisals. Esteban Monteo's mother, for example, was certainly influenced by them. But to the extent that there are glimmers of truth here, it is important to follow the leads back to the African antecedents and there discover as much as possible about the beliefs, aspirations, fears, and accomplishments of these enslaved persons. That's what I was just talking about. That's what I was just talking about, right? Now you have some names. Take those names, I'm talking about names of groups of people. Take those names, look up the people. Check the region. What was, what does the history, historical documents say about the region where you are? What kind of people typically were brought there? Were kidnapped and brought to that, space. And now look up those people, study them, right? Go back as best as you can, discover as much as possible about the beliefs, the aspirations, the fears, and the accomplishments of these people before they were enslaved persons. To continue. At least the Latin American and West Indian scholarship makes some attempt to achieve this, as it approaches the problem of African enslaved laborers with the understanding that they were persons extracted from distinctive communities in Africa and removed to places of perverse hostility and irrationality. Some people ain't gonna like that. Some people ain't gonna like that. I can tell you for a fact, as a kid, I've been around and read a lot of different material that talked about, in fact, I have some family members back home who wrote about where our people came from, right? Which I believe is the Twa people, right? Labor extractions followed spatial extractions. Psychological dislocations necessarily flowed from displacement of another kind. The African response to regimes of exploitation was therefore complex and intricate. Africans were often identified by their ethnicity, affixed as it was to their names. There is greater evidence for this in the Caribbean and South America than in North America, but the same pattern can be found in the latter. It is certainly possible to explain this as a putative process, but it could not have been purely so, as African agency was just as clearly a factor. The innovation was not in the concept of ethnicity or region or origin, but in making such a descriptive part of the personal name. As such, ethnicity became associated with the individual African. But beyond this, we have the phenomenon of Africans gathering and organizing among themselves on the basis of ethnicity all over the New World. From 1712 slave revolt in New York City, an Akan-led affair, to the 1739, so we do get that in New York City there was an Akan-led affair, right? To the 1739 Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina, an Angolan West Central African venture, to the 1835 Mali uprising in Bahia, with the Yoruba as the principals, to cite just a few examples. These moments of social integration could not have been derivative of slaveholder misidentification. The cumulative evidence therefore leads to one conclusion. Africans in the New World were very much aware of who they had been in the Old, and engaged patterns of collective behavior that sought to recapture and reinforce Old World realities. The same Africans who arrived in the West Indies and South America also came to what would become the United States, albeit in different patterns of importation, carrying the same sense of collective identity. Scholars of North American slavery need to either reconsider the African antecedent as playing a major role in the histories of cultures of people of African descent, and thereby retool, or they need to consider changing to a field of inquiry in which they can more accurately demonstrate their expertise. And that's the end of the paper, right? That's the end of the paper. But you see, there's something that's lost here in North America. And I blame fading memory, but I blame the school system. The school system is not going to constantly remind you that you are an African. You know what they constantly remind you of? That you are an American descendant of slavery. ADOS. That's what the school system constantly reminds you. So it disconnects you from your original African tradition, your original African identity. But your ancestors, as we see here listed in the few slave revolt examples, your ancestors knew who was a Khan, who was Angolan or West Central African, who was Bahia or Yoruba. But you've allowed yourself to forget. And the school system assisted you heavily in forgetting. This is why you must have an African-centered education. African-centered education would reunite you with your African tradition and will give you the knowledge necessary to solve the problems in your African community. This is the mistake right here that we've been making. And if you support these grifters who are pushing the ADOS and the FBA and all this old foolishness, you're supporting your demise. Whenever you see a grifter jumping from, well, we were Moors to Native Americans with FBA, you got to be smarter than that. But the problem is that if you've been miseducated, maybe you're not smarter than that. I'm just keeping it real. And so we gotta tackle this miseducation problem. It's time for me too to go back and look up some of those books. It's time for you to get on board and change the course of our future. This arguing about ADOS and FBA, as we should know by now, is just nonsense. Your ancestors knew themselves to be African. They didn't know themselves to be no Native Americans. And so we gotta start doing the work outside of Africa. Those of us outside of the continent, we gotta start doing the work to understand who are our people and reconnect with our relatives on the continent. Hope you guys enjoyed this reading. Hope you guys enjoyed this paper. I have some work to do in terms of papers and updating the Discord with them. But I'll definitely upload this paper into the Discord so you can download it yourself. Hopefully you guys are reading these things for yourselves as well and starting to draw connections between, you know, papers I did in the past to papers I'm doing now. Right? I spoke to a Haitian friend of mine when I did that paper some time ago that talked about the ethnicities of Africans in Haiti at the time of, you know, prior to and at the time of the Haitian Revolution. I spoke to him. He said, yeah, there's still some people who call themselves by those names. Is there no surprise then? What has been the greatest revolt of the formerly enslaved in this whole hemisphere? Get back to your African identity. Stop identifying yourself as a slave or as the descendants of slaves. Those people were African people. If you ask them where they were from, they will tell you where they were from, and it was from the continent. Hausa, Congo, Nago, whatever it was, they will tell you. It's time to get off of the dumb shit now. It doesn't help us, it doesn't serve us, and it definitely doesn't free us. I want to thank you guys for tuning in to the show, and I hope to see you guys the next time, which should be Tuesday, that I do another show again. All right, thanks for listening. I posted the link to the Discord. Make sure you click the link. Join us. Ask us how you can help. Until next time, peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.